Good morning, everyone. It is good to be here. So this morning, I will give a brief description of the DeLuca Preserve and kind of where it's been and where we're going. And then we'll transition into a presentation on the Grasshopper Sparrow by Dr. Reed Bowman and Fabby Baeza as well. All right, so if you're unfamiliar where the DeLuca Preserve is, it is actually in Yeehaw Junction. I've highlighted on the map where the research or the Range Cattle Research and Education Center is and Gainesville, and then where Yeehaw Junction is. So if you don't know where the DeLuca Preserve is located, um, then you'll know that it is actually in Yeehaw Junction, and it's in the southeast corner of Osceola County. And just to blow that up a little bit, or quite a bit, um, the DeLuca Preserve is southwest of the intersection of State Road 60 and Highway 441. So it goes approximately 8 miles west from Yeehaw Junction and about 4 miles south on Highway 441. And there is a little bit of a section on the east side of 441 as well. It is 27,000 acres. So the property was donated to the University of Florida Foundation back in 2020. The easement is held by Ducks Unlimited, and they divided this into 6 primary use types. So wetlands, watercourses, and water bodies, about 6,700 acres, 5,300 acres of upland forest, 7,400 acres of native rangeland, a little over 800 acres of what we're calling cultivated agriculture. So this is going to be mostly the citrus production areas, but also a couple outlying areas that can be cultivated. Improved pastures around 6,600 acres, and I think this kind of includes some of the semi-native, what some people would consider to be semi-native pastures as well. And then intensive use areas, 100 acres, and that's where we can establish some buildings on the property. There's several different soil types on the DeLuca Preserve. The primary ones are Smyrna, Basinger, Mayaca, Ugali, Pompano, and Malabar. Like I said, there are several other soil types, but those are the primary ones, comprising about 18 to 20,000 acres. The management activities on the ranch have been and will continue to be in the foreseeable future: citrus production, cattle. Cattle are grazing approximately 2/3 of the 27,000 acres, maybe a little bit less than that. Prescribed fire is absolutely a management activity that's been ongoing there. Every site's burned on about a 2 to 3 year cycle. There are active hunting leases on the site, and we do harvest palmetto berries as well as native seed harvesting. There are some other activities that have happened in the past, but they aren't very consistent from year to year. So just want to give you an overview of what some of the habitat types look like. Dry prairie on the left, pine overstory with palmetto understory in the center, improved pastures, and then some improved pastures that are reverting back to what I would call native rangeland, just due to management over time. And it's just a very diverse habitat, a lot of different ecosystems throughout the property. Kind of a scenic view on the left here shows some of an example of one of the wetlands on the property. And overall, the property is fairly pristine. It does have some issues in some places with lygodium or climbing fern. This is one of the areas where climbing fern is invading. This is not the worst climbing fern that's on the property by far. So that is something that we're going to have to continue to monitor and work on. Another invasive species that I was initially worried about on the property would have been Kogan grass, but they've really stayed on top of Kogan grass on that property. There is Kogan grass there, but they are actively managing Kogan grass throughout the property. So recently, the Dean of Research Office awarded some projects on the DeLuca Preserve. These are the 8 projects that were awarded internally by UF-IFAS, and it includes baseline assessment of hydrology and microbes, soil health, and geospatial features of the property, how grazing management impacts bird diversity and abundance, new and improved citrus scion and rootstock combinations, monitor animal diversity in relation to oak activity patterns, looking at mosquito blood meal derived DNA to estimate what vertebrate animals are on the property, mapping plant diversity using LIDAR and hyperspectral imaging, fungal diversity, which is something that is completely understudied apparently. I had no idea about that. And development of a bioeconomic model for wildfire risk. And this really has to do with forest management. And that's not only going to be focused on DeLuca, but surrounding properties as well. So those are some of the projects that are upcoming. I think one of the things that DeLuca really highlights or that we should be looking at is his involvement or proximity to the wildlife corridor. So this is a picture that Archbold was able to share with me a few weeks ago. And you have Avon Park Air Force Range, Kissimmee Prairie Preserve State Park, all bordering the DeLuca Preserve, and just the continuity of the wildlife landscape that this provides is something that I think is very beneficial for this property, especially when you talk about endangered species. So one of them is the red cockaded woodpecker. So there's potential that we do have these on the site. There are trees with cavities on the DeLuca Preserve that have been marked. And there's been great care taken when they've been doing the prescribed burns to make sure that the fires don't get too hot around those trees that have cavities. The next species that's also endangered is the Florida Grasshopper Sparrow, and that's why I invited our guests today to talk about their project on the DeLuca Preserve that's been going on for the last 4 to 5 years. And I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Bowman.
Thank you, Brent. So I want to talk about the grasshopper sparrow in a little bit of a broader perspective initially. So the grasshopper sparrow is an endangered subspecies, a subspecies, one of 12 of the fairly widely distributed grasshopper sparrow. So there are 4 subspecies in North America, one of which is the Florida grasshopper sparrow. And you can see it's endemic to Florida. It is non-migratory, whereas many of the others are migratory, but not all of them. There are 4 subspecies that are in the Caribbean, some of which are endemic to various islands, and there's 4 subspecies that are throughout Mexico and Central America, some of which also are non-migratory. In Florida, we actually have 2 of those subspecies, Floridanus, which is the endemic resident species, and then Pratensis, which is the migratory eastern grasshopper sparrow. So during the winter, the prairies in Florida are full of both subspecies, and then during the breeding season, it is only Floridanus. So that does create some confusion sometimes, because you may go out to a prairie, hear grasshopper sparrows or see grasshopper sparrows, but it turns out they're Pratensis occupying only pastures during the winter, and their distribution is quite different. So this is very typical Florida dry prairie. So it is a mosaic of different habitat types. I chose this picture because it shows that quite nicely. It's a grassland dominated system, but it's got palmetto. It's even got patches of drier areas where we get runner oak and things like that. So, but the main thing I use this picture for is to show the vastness of Florida dry prairie. It is a treeless habitat, and in many cases, it occurs at very large acreages. And that is critical to the Florida grasshopper sparrow, because it evolved in more or less a treeless system, and it tries to avoid trees at all costs. This is the historic distribution of dry prairie in Florida, and you can see it had a fairly wide distribution throughout Central Florida, going all the way to the West Coast, but following some of the ridges along the center part of the state. The vast majority of that has disappeared. Many of it, we estimate about 98% habitat loss of the original dry prairie. What occurs now is an isolated fragments surrounded by working landscapes, ranches, and development. What's interesting is we know very little about the remnants of dry prairie, and whether or not what remains of dry prairie is actually representative of the range of habitat that existed initially. It could be that certain types of habitat were actually developed first. And so this may not be representational of all the diversity of dry prairie that existed historically. But as I said, it's a grassland community. It historically burned every 1 to 2 years, and it's low and open with very few trees. Our current management is prescribed fire, but also we're in areas where that haven't had prescribed fire rapidly, tree removal and sometimes roller chopping too encourages the herbaceous dominance of grasses in that habitat. So this is the current distribution of grasshopper sparrows, and you can see these are the public lands that currently maintain it. These are 3 different sites on Avon Park, Kissimmee Prairie, and up here at Three Lakes Wildlife Management Area. These are the public lands that were known up until a few years ago, and we'll add DeLuca in here in a second. In 1998, most of these populations appeared to be at their maximum. There was about 320 to 350 singing males among all these populations, and point counts were being conducted at all the sites. And as I said, they occurred in 3 property and 6 distinct sites, because you can see at Avon Park, there were 3 different patches of prairie, all of which had grasshopper sparrows. In 1998, we also had the formation of the Florida Grasshopper Sparrow Working Group, which has been one of the most successful interactions between staff of agencies, universities, and NGOs, all working together to figure out not only the natural history of the grasshopper sparrow, but effective conservation of it. Because these patches are all distributed widely, one of our first questions is this a metapopulation? Do these birds move among these populations, and is their demography correlated with each other? Early studies suggested the dispersal was frequent enough that these could be metapopulations, and subsequent genetic studies supported that, in that there's very little range-wide genetic structure, suggesting that we get at least enough movement to maintain genetic diversity and heterogeneity among these different populations. And that suggests the potential for both potentially demographic rescue and genetic rescue, which is really important in framing our conservation strategies for this subspecies. This is the habitat that the Florida grasshopper sparrow evolved in. It burned regularly, but it also flooded regularly too. So sparrows have been caught between 2 ecological disturbances, and that's shaped their natural history. So, like I said, it's non-migratory, it's endemic to these Florida dry prairie habitats. At least that has been the existing paradigm. It feeds on insects and seeds. This is the classic R-selected species. It's relatively short-lived, but it can be highly productive. This is largely a terrestrial species, even though it's a bird, but it tends to run around on the ground. And so this is very much the avian analog of a mouse. They do great out on dry prairie. Their response to fire, this is just density. You can see densities are highest immediately after a fire. They love to move into prairie right after it burns, and they stay high, but then they start to decline. Demography matches this as well. In fact, this is the classic boom or bust species. So sometimes they can have 3 to 5 successful broods, often in that first year after a fire. By 2 years after a fire, they're sort of holding their own. And by 3 years after a fire, these are sink populations. Mortality is greatly exceeding reproduction. So they're responding to fire, and that boom bust cycle is really, really important. But then they have to contend with the onset of the rainy season. And you can see here, they are ground nesters. Here's a hidden nest on the prairie. But once we get into that rainy season, these nests get flooded. And this is one of our techs, Becky Windsor, standing in a flooded prairie, holding nestlings that had been flooded out of their nest. Had she not been there to actually, these birds ultimately contributed to the captive breeding population, but they would have died. So they're caught between these 2 dynamics that have short-term negative effects, but probably also essential long-term contributions to the success of the sparrow on this habitat. And this is the pattern of population change over time for those 3 different sites. And so this is in the 1990s where most of our populations were high, near their peaks. What was interesting in those first few years is we had one population go up and go down. One population went from high to low, but they all sort of ultimately came back to a place they'd been previously. Then we had the big decline in the Avon Park population. It looked for a while like all the other populations were doing the same thing, but those populations seem to have recovered. And at this point, if we looked at the populations around here, we have 2 populations that seem to be having lots of annual fluctuations. One seems to be more or less stable over time. One suggests it might be a shallow decline, and one had a really tremendous decline. But by about 2011, it became evident that all these populations were declining, and you can see up through 2020, they all were. Now, as I said, these are the populations that were on public lands. But in about 2014, we became aware of the population on DeLuca, which is here. Now, the occurrence of Florida grasshopper sparrows on working landscapes was well known, but it wasn't clear whether these were breeding populations or refugia of birds that may be escaping inappropriate conditions on the dry prairie. And both Avon Park and Kissimmee Prairie Preserve were grazed until relatively recently. So it's not like these public dry prairies were free of grazing. And if you look through the literature, the conclusions about impacts on grazing on grassland birds are somewhat mixed. There's clear evidence that there are positive effects, but there are also evidences of negative effects. So the state began monitoring Florida grasshopper sparrows on what was at the time the Destiny Ranch. Archbold has continued that since 2007, and of course the transition in 2020, 2021 to the DeLuca Preserve. So I'm going to turn it over to Fabby Baeza, who's our lead on the DeLuca project, and she's going to talk about some of the demographic conditions of the species on DeLuca.
Thank you, Reed. All right. So in 2014, when this population of sparrows was found on DeLuca, FWC started monitoring the whole property to try and delineate potential habitat for Florida grasshopper sparrows. Now, most of our efforts have focused in Field 1 throughout the years because that's where our sparrows are condensed. And up until this year, we started, expanding our efforts and surveying more areas in the other fields. However, we found that no other sparrows were found in any of the other fields, even though they are pretty much the same habitat as in Field 1. They have improved pastures, they have semi-improved pastures, and native dry prairie. So here is a map distribution of our birds in Field 1. And in the blue, we have 25 male territories, and in the yellow, we have 9 female territories. Now, the stars are areas where we found Florida grasshopper sparrow nests, color-coded by their fate. And it is important to point out that all of these birds establish their territories in areas of improved pasture and semi-improved pasture, even though there is a tract of native dry prairie that is in great condition in this area. They all chose to establish themselves elsewhere. So you may be wondering how we have such exact numbers of Florida grasshopper sparrows. Well, there is a number of things that happen throughout the field season. First off, we do point count surveys, which looks something like this. Our point count surveys are spread throughout our study area, and they are listening stations. They start 15 minutes pre-civil twilight and go on to hours post-sunrise. This is because this is the window of time when birds are more active and more vocal, so easier to detect in the landscape. So simplified point count surveys, like I said, are listening stations. We go and stand in a particular area for 5 minutes, and we listen for the Florida grasshopper sparrow to detect the presence by their song, which sounds something like this. This is their very well-known buzz song, which is where they get their name grasshopper sparrow. It closely resembles, the call of a grasshopper, and it can very well trick a non-experienced ear. However, a Florida grasshopper sparrow can also sound like this. This is their more complex song, or warble, which only males that are paired do. To give you a full effect on what our mornings sound like, here's a little playback. So there are many, very many different species calling every single morning. And, we wish that it was as easy as just listening that one song all the time. But sometimes our birds are very hard to detect. And sometimes we don't detect them by any of their songs. Sometimes we do it by their call or their seeps. All right. So all of our birds in our 4 populations are banded. And we made it a goal to band all these sparrows so that we know exactly where and when these birds came from. So every single bird has a very unique combination of color bands or auxiliary markers on their legs, which let us know all this information. This also helps to know how long a bird lived, so we assess survival and immigration rates with all these information. So there is this novel methodology that was developed by FWC and first implemented at Three Lakes Wildlife Management Area to increase their nest success. We have a little diagram here. And what we do is we install predator fences once a nest is found. The moment we find it, if not after the last leg is laid. So we install this fence around the nest, then we secure the bottom of it with foam and staples so that no snake can slither underneath the gap of the ground and the fence. And again, we set it up as soon as we find it, and this is removed as soon as the nestlings leave the nest. We also install nest cameras that are facing the nest entrance to monitor the fate of the nest in case one day we come back and we don't know the nest is empty and we don't know what happened to the nest. And in places like DeLuca, which is the only place where sparrows coexist with cattle, then we also install the electric fences to keep cattle from going into our nest exclosures. Given the success that all these methods brought to Three Lakes Wildlife Management Area, all the other sites started implementing a combination of these management tools to increase their nest survival at their sites. So here is what a nest exclosure looks at DeLuca. We have our predator fence that is secured with foam and staples. Then we also have our electric fence towards the end. We do leave the vegetation within our predator fence intact because females are very sensitive to any type of disturbance around their nest. However, we do trim all the vegetation outside the predator fence to keep any snakes from using the vegetation as a ladder to climb over the fence. Now, there are sometimes very large snakes that can still get into our predator exclosures, so they are not 100% snake proof, but this greatly reduces the depredation by snakes. So some of the results that we got from this is that this is Three Lakes Wildlife Management Area data, and we can see that before our nest exclosures in 2013 and 2014, daily survival probability, which is pretty much the likelihood of a nest to survive from one day to the other, was barely above 90%. However, in 2015, when we start fencing, daily survival probability was upwards of 95%. So unfortunately, nest depredation is not the only thing that we have to mitigate for. There's other abiotic factors that we have to mitigate, such as flooding. And like Reed said, the Dry Prairie is very well known for flooding during the wet season. In this case, we developed this novel methodology of lifting nests. And here we have a little diagram of how this happens. We have a nest in the center. Then we use a shovel to cut the diameter around this nest. And here's how this happens. Then the person with the shovel is lifting the nest, and the second person is shoving soil underneath this nest. This makes the nest sit higher than the rest of the ground by a couple of inches. And here we see how this works. We have a lifted dry nest, and then all around it we have standing water. This nest would have likely failed due to flooding had it not been lifted. Even with all these conservation tools, we noticed that at DeLuca we were still not having great nest success. Which brings me to my next topic, red imported fire ants, or RIFA hereafter. Of course, I'm sure all of you are familiar with the red imported fire ants. They are an invasive species of ants that come from South America that have established themselves throughout the United States. They are known, they vary by site, but they are known to be more abundant in areas where there has been land disturbance. And of course, at DeLuca, where there is cattle, there is constant disturbance by that, and of course, as well as the land management practices. So at DeLuca, we noticed that predation by these red imported fire ants were very high. And of course, very teeny tiny animals are not excluded by our predator fences. In this regard, we started employing the hot water treatment that was first developed by Dr. Josh King by UCF. He used this first on nesting sea turtles, and we started implementing it on our Florida grasshopper sparrow nest. And what we do is that we find every fire ant mound at a radius of 25 to 30 meters around an active Florida grasshopper sparrow nest, and we treat them with boiling hot water. We time these treatments to happen a couple of days prior to hatching because most of the depredation events happen during the nesting stage. By timing these treatments, we don't give fire ants the opportunity to reestablish themselves in the area before the nest cycle is complete. So by implementing this treatment, we noticed that that greatly increased our nest success at DeLuca. So this is how it happens. The picture on the left is a very outdated photo of what this looks like. Right now we have a very more sophisticated fire ant trailer that we carry out to the pastures with us. And what it does is basically a water tank. The water runs through a burner, and that spits out boiling hot water, which would then carry through the pastures. It has a very long hose and a wand at the end. And what I'm doing right there is I'm sticking the wand into the ground, into a fire ant mound, and blasting them with boiling hot water. And here we have a not so pleasant photo of a fire ant depredating on a small little nestling. So what can we conclude? Of course, Florida grasshopper sparrows are still a very conservation-reliant species. And we now know that fencing alone is not effective, and we must include red and poor fire ant treatments in order to increase our nest success. As we can see here, we have the ranch and fence data in 2015, with the daily survival probability just being over 85%. We start fencing, and in 2016, we were able to bring it up just a little bit. After red and poor fire ant treatments in 2017, through the right of this yellow line, we can see that our nest success was very high. It went up upwards of 95%, which means that our productivity can be equivalent or greater than that of the prairie sites by using the same conservation tools. It is important to point out that even now, some of the sites with Dry Prairie are starting to treat for fire ants as well. We also have a couple of other things going on for us. One of them is that our adult survival is equivalent to that of prairie sites as well, and we're one of the sites with the highest immigration rate every single year. So we have a bar graph of our nest fates from 2016 to 2020. And I think what is important to point out here is that the pink bar, which is our fledged nest, increases after 2017. So by doing these fire ant treatments, we have eliminated nest losses caused by fire ants. And here is a reflection of our productivity. We have on the blue the number of hatched birds, and in the pink the number of fledged birds. And I think it is very obvious to me that after 2017 that pink bar just gets greater and greater, which means that more nestlings are making it to the fledged state, so therefore there's more recruitment into the population. And like I mentioned briefly, DeLuca is the site with the highest immigration rate every single year. Every year we get about 6 unbanded males and about 5 unbanded females, compared to the other sites who only get about 0 to 4 adults every single year. So by looking at this population trends, we can see that, of course, we have Three Lakes Wildlife Management Area in the blue and DeLuca in the yellow, the 2 largest populations. And we can see that from 2015 up to 2018, there was a very obvious decline. However, in 2018 and 19, there is an upward trend in the population, which is merely the response of all these management tools that we have been applying to this population. Also, like Reed said, the species is a boom bust species, and I think it is likely that both of these populations, even though they are in very different habitat types, are responding to the same ecological variables. And I'll hand it back to Reed.
I just want to reiterate that point that Fabby made, which is, if you look, granted, there's just a few years where we have data for DeLuca and the other sites, but the population trends mirror each other, whether you're in a pasture site or on the prairie sites. So a good year for one is a good year for all. That does emphasize that it's possible that both these populations are responding to similar ecological factors, but it also supports this idea that these are metapopulations where demography and population trends are somewhat correlated. So in 2014, we got thinking about these sparrows on working landscapes. And the paradigm had been that this was an endemic, narrowly restricted to native dry prairie. And, but it seems clear that sparrows may be able to exist on a broader range of habitat conditions. It's very likely, as I mentioned before, that there are sparrows on other ranches, and sparrows can be productive on ranches. So, you know, one of the things that's interesting is when we find these populations, they're large. We don't know what's happened to them in the past. They may have been in some steep decline. But remember that when we found this population, it had received none of these conservation benefits. So the sparrows had persisted on that ranch. However, in order to make them productive, not only on ranches, but also on native dry prairie, right now, this subspecies is dependent on fencing and fire ants. So I think we're in the middle of a shift in paradigm that this is not a species restricted to dry prairie, but may be able to be self-sustaining on working landscapes. So what will it take to make grasshopper sparrows productive on other ranches that might employ a similar management regime? So last year in 2020, working with the managers at DeLuca, we submitted and received a Partners in Fish and Wildlife grant, and that was to experimentally sort of test a wildlife habitat management plan that was written in 2014, which more or less was what we thought we should be doing on native dry prairie for Florida grasshopper sparrows. However, DeLuca Ranch is sort of ideally situated, ideally organized for a large-scale experimental test of various regimes. As Brent mentioned early on, almost half the landscape at DeLuca is either native grasslands or improved or semi-native. And most of that improved and semi-native occurs up here in the north, and most of the native is down here in the south. So what we were proposing, we haven't done this yet, but it is at that point where we're discussing it, is an experimental assessment of management regimes. Now, one of the problems with the habitat management plan is there was a lot of different things they wanted to do. If you wanted to have a fully crossed experimental design, you'd have to have literally, and you wanted to have replication, you'd literally have to have hundreds and hundreds of plots to do this. So we've adapted a model that's being used at Buck Island Ranch, which is to have an experiment that contrasts habitat and management regimes rather than all the individual aspects of a management regime. So what we're proposing is a fully crossed experiment that includes improved and semi-native pasture as one factor and dry prairie as another factor in a habitat treatment. And then sort of business as usual. What is the sort of our typical management regime for cattle on a working cattle ranch, which is biennial winter burning, mowing and chopping as needed, rotational grazing with no exclusions. We are adding fire ant treatments and controls in both of these factors in the management regime. And then the other factor in there would be sort of the aspirational Florida grasshopper sparrow management, which is biennial transition season burning, so that period in between the dry season and the rainy season when we think historically a lot of fires occurred in Florida. But we would only do this in unoccupied habitat, and biennial late winter burning in occupied habitat. We think, we don't know, but we're working on the assumption that because the sparrow populations are so low, the short-term costs of early transition season burning in occupied habitat may be too much for this small population to bear, whereas it would have been, the species would have been much more resilient when its populations were large. We would also have rotational grazing, but we would have some deferments for 8 to 10 weeks after burning, and potentially also in occupied habitat during the breeding season, and fire ant treatments as well. So this might give us a sense of which of these treatments, and then you could do smaller manipulations to test individual factors within there. We are also right now in the process of developing assertive grant. We're actually well along the process, and in fact, we're in the final stage of funding for this. And we would essentially be doing a similar large experiment using some of these same things at Avon Park Air Force Range. However, at Avon Park Air Force Range, right, they don't currently have a grazing program. So this would allow us to do no grazing treatments, but not on a working landscape. On a working landscape, we want to maintain grazing as the only option to be able to look at these factors. So we're hoping that this will help us to begin to understand how sparrows are responding to grazing management and how they're persisting on working landscapes as opposed to dry prairie. Our response variables here would be occupancy, whether or not grasshopper sparrows are there, but also occupancy by a bunch of surrogate grassland bird species, such as meadowlarks, Bachman sparrows, and things like that. And then where pastures are occupied, we can actually use grasshopper sparrow and surrogate species demographic responses as response variables. So this is sort of in a discussion phase right now. But our future directions are really to go back to the original problem and understand what were the environmental factors that led to the decline of the Florida grasshopper sparrow originally. As far as we know, we haven't resolved those things. So we have to get back to those original questions: is what has caused those declines, and were those causes similar between dry prairie habitat and working grasslands? We're also using captive breeding and releases to augment and grow extinct populations, and the potential exists for us to be able to actually reintroduce grasshopper sparrows into working landscapes. And then to understand effective management regimes on both native prairie and working grasslands, and especially on working grasslands regimes that consider the economics of ranching. And ultimately, expand our goals to include healthy Florida grasshopper sparrow populations on both native prairie and working landscapes. And I'd just like to acknowledge this is, you know, sometimes we say we, but this has been a huge collaborative group between a bunch of different agencies, NGOs, federal and state agencies, and private ranchers. So thanks to all that and all the people that have contributed to that. So thank you very much.
All right, do we have any questions from the audience? Not seeing any. All right, well, I will turn it over to Andrea. If you do end up having questions for either myself or Dr. Bowman or Fabby, please reach out to us. You can find me at the Range Cattle REC website, or Reed and Fabby at the Archbold Biological Station website. All right, Andrea.
Okay. All right. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. Just wanted to mention a few upcoming events that we've got going, including our next ONA highlight, which is also going to feature another guest speaker, and that is on October the 18th. And actually, I think it's the 19th, but whenever I send you this recording, I will send you the exact date. This is going to be an LTAR update, the long-term agro ecosystem research highlight, and it's going to feature guest speaker Dr. Sherry Spiegel. Dr. Spiegel will present using manure shed management to connect distant links of the beef supply chain. She is a range management specialist at the USDA ARS Range Management Research Unit in La Crosse, New Mexico, where she conducts collaborative research to understand the effects of agricultural management strategies on environmental, economic, and social sustainability outcomes in U.S. agriculture. So be sure and check that out. And like I said, I will confirm that date because I'm really pretty positive it's the 19th. So I'm sorry for that incorrect date. Next week is going to be the Winter Supplementation Seminar. That event is going to take place in Pasco County in Dade City at the Extension Auditorium. It's an evening program. And let me see my notes. This program, as far as I know, is being offered either virtually or in person. If you would like to attend virtually, the fee is $5,
and it is $10 if in person, and supper is included. We've got a couple of our faculty members speaking at that one, and a guest, Dr. Chet Taylor. So I'm sure it's going to be a great program if you can make it. And then I have news. So the next event I'd like to share about is our field day. And I just found out today that we are going to be transitioning from an in-person to a virtual program. So this schedule that you see is going to be changing slightly, and everything's probably going to be changing a little bit, but it's still going to be October 7th, and more than likely a morning program from 9 to 12. So be watching for those changes coming soon, as well as that registration information. The following day is going to be the Cattlewomen's College. This is a limited event. Usually I think they limit it to 40 people. So it's probably close to full. So if this is an event that you would like to attend, you need to sign up soon. I will also send you that registration information when I send you this recording. If you're not already doing so, please consider following us on Facebook or Twitter or our YouTube channel so you can catch all of our latest videos as they're uploaded. And if you don't get our weekly news blasts on Friday, please consider sending us an email to the email address ona@ifas.ufl.edu, and I will add you to our list so that you don't miss any upcoming announcements. So thank you again for joining us, and hope to see you in October.